Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11, Moon landing, NASA 1969, Cold War space race, first humans on the moon. You already know the headline, but you don't know the silence. Because history remembers sound bites. It remembers Armstrong's voice, but what it forgets is what it felt like. Imagine this. You're sealed inside a machine thinner than a soda can in places. Outside, a vacuum that will kill you instantly. Below, a surface no human has ever touched. Behind you, the entire weight of the Cold War. And ahead, the unknown. The descent of the lunar module Eagle wasn't cinematic. It was math. It was warning lights. It was controlled fear. 1202 alarm. Computer overload. A system never meant to multitask under this kind of strain. Fuel ticking down. 60 seconds. 30. If they aborted too late, they'd crash. If they aborted too early, the mission would fail. Armstrong sees boulders the size of cars. He takes manual control. Houston goes quiet. Not dramatic quiet. Professional quiet. The kind where every breath matters. And then, Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Relief floods Earth. But on the moon, there is no applause. Only stillness. The dust hasn't even settled yet. And for the first time in 4.5 billion years, the moon is no longer alone. People think the moon landing started with Apollo 11. Didn't. It started with fear. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a metal sphere no bigger than a beach ball. But when it began orbiting Earth, it shattered American confidence. Because if they could send that into orbit, they could send something else. Something nuclear. The sky was no longer protection. It was a battlefield. Enter President John F. Kennedy. In 1961, he stood before Congress and made a promise so bold it bordered on reckless. We choose to go to the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. That line is quoted endlessly, but what it really meant was this: we are betting our reputation on physics. At the time, NASA had barely figured out how to keep astronauts alive in orbit. The moon was 240,000 miles away. There were no GPS satellites. No digital redundancy systems like we have today. Computers had less processing power than a modern calculator. And yet, they built the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever constructed at that point in human history. 3 stages. 363 feet tall. 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. When it launched, the ground shook for miles. Birds fell from the sky. Windows rattled. The air itself seemed to ripple. But the rocket wasn't the most dangerous part. Re-entry was. Docking in lunar orbit was. And the lunar module? It looked fragile. Spindly legs. Thin aluminum skin. It was never meant to look powerful. It was meant to work in vacuum. Designed for an environment with no air, no weather, no forgiveness. That's important. Because the moon doesn't care about ambition. It doesn't care about flags. It doesn't care about human dreams. It only cares about physics. And physics is ruthless. Neil Armstrong gets most of the spotlight. But Buzz Aldrin wasn't just the second man. He was a PhD in orbital mechanics. He wrote his doctoral thesis on rendezvous techniques in space. In other words, he helped invent the math that made the moon landing possible. Precise orbital docking was not optional. It was survival. If the lunar module failed to redock with Michael Collins in orbit, Armstrong and Aldrin would die on the moon. And Collins? He would return to Earth alone. That possibility wasn't hypothetical. NASA had contingency speeches ready. President Nixon had one written in case the astronauts were stranded. Imagine hearing that broadcast. 2 men left behind. Their oxygen running out. The world watching. Magnificent. Desolation. Those words would have felt different. But they didn't. Because the ascent engine fired. Because the docking succeeded. Because everything worked. Against the odds. But let's go back to the moment that matters most. The hatch opens. Armstrong descends first. The ladder is narrow. His boots bulky. He reaches the footpad. And then, he steps. One small step for man. The line echoes through history. But here's what's rarely discussed. Armstrong's microphone wasn't even meant to capture poetic speeches. This wasn't theater. It was documentation. After him, Buzz Aldrin climbs down. He doesn't rush. He pauses. He looks. And what he sees isn't triumph. It's something far stranger. The moon's surface isn't smooth. It's layered in dust called regolith. Fine as powder. Sharp as glass under magnification. The horizon curves closer than Earth's does. Because the moon is smaller. The sky above is pitch black. Even though it's daytime. No blue. No clouds. Just endless void. And Earth? A marble suspended in darkness. That's when he says it. Magnificent desolation. Not shouted. Not rehearsed. Observed. 2 words. But those 2 words may be the most accurate description of space ever spoken. Because the moon is beautiful. And it is empty. Completely empty. No wind. No sound. No movement. Every footprint will last for millions of years. Because nothing erases it. That realization shifts something inside a human being. You are standing somewhere untouched. But you are also completely alone. That duality is the future of space exploration. There's something most documentaries skip. Before Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the moon, he waited. Not because of protocol. Because of intention. Inside the lunar module, time felt distorted. The mission timeline said one thing. The body said another. They had just survived a descent that nearly ended in disaster. Fuel reserves had dropped to less than 30 seconds before abort. The computer alarms, 1201 and 1202, weren't cosmetic warnings. They were signs that the onboard guidance computer was being overwhelmed. It was only because of a young engineer in mission control, Steve Bales, who recognized that the alarms could be ignored safely, that the landing continued. One decision. One human interpretation of blinking code. And history continued. Now imagine standing in that cabin. Your suit pressurized. Your oxygen limited. Outside, 240,000 miles from help. There is no rescue mission possible. No backup rocket waiting nearby. You are either self-sufficient, or you are dead. Before exiting, Buzz requested something deeply personal. He asked Mission Control for a moment of radio silence. He took out a small communion kit. Bread, wine. And on the moon, on another world, he quietly observed a private religious ritual. No grand announcement. No broadcast to millions. Just a moment of reflection. He later described reading from the Gospel of John. The light shines in the darkness. Think about that. The first act performed on another celestial body wasn't conquest. It wasn't science. It was reflection. That matters. Because it tells you something about the psychology of explorers. When confronted with overwhelming isolation, humans reach for meaning. Not technology. Meaning. And then the hatch opened. Armstrong descended. The world focused on his words. But inside that helmet, Aldrin was processing something deeper. This wasn't just achievement. It was exposure. Exposure to an environment that does not care if you live. And that awareness is what shaped the 6 syllables that followed. Magnificent. Desolation. He wasn't being poetic. He was being precise. While 2 men stood on the moon, 1 man orbited alone. Michael Collins. History often forgets him. But for 21 hours, he was the most isolated human being in existence. When the command module passed behind the moon, radio contact with Earth vanished. No voice. No reassurance. No real-time support. Just silence. Complete silence. Imagine floating in orbit, knowing that if the ascent engine on the lunar module fails, you must leave your friends behind. Mission protocol was clear. If Armstrong and Aldrin couldn't lift off, Collins would return alone. That wasn't cruelty. It was practicality. There was no way to save them. Collins later described that isolation not as fear, but as awareness. He knew that if something went wrong, the world would remember him differently. The man who came home. Without them, desolation doesn't just describe landscapes. It describes responsibility. When Aldrin said, magnificent desolation, He was unknowingly describing the entire Apollo mission, a stunning achievement, balanced on catastrophic risk. And here's what's haunting. If the ascent engine had failed, the astronauts had no way to repair it. No spare parts, no second chance. They would have slowly run out of oxygen, and NASA would have cut the transmission. President Nixon's prepared speech began like this: "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." Let that sink in. The moon could have become a grave. Instead, it became a gateway, because the ascent engine fired, because the rendezvous succeeded, because mathematics held. But that fragility changed NASA forever. After Apollo 11, space exploration stopped being about planting flags. It became about sustainability. When humans encounter extreme isolation, something happens neurologically. Antarctica missions, submarine patrols, long-duration space simulations. Researchers have found consistent patterns: heightened introspection, altered perception of time, emotional amplification, increased appreciation for Earth. Astronauts call it the overview effect. Seeing Earth from space changes you. Borders disappear. Conflicts feel smaller. The planet looks fragile. Buzz Aldrin experienced that effect in reverse. He wasn't looking at Earth from orbit. He was standing somewhere Earth wasn't. That's different, because orbit keeps you connected visually. The moon makes Earth distant, small, reachable only by days of travel. That distance forces clarity. Magnificent, the beauty of the cosmos. Desolation, the isolation of it. Modern astronaut training now includes psychological resilience protocols. Why? Because future missions won't be 3 days away from Earth. Mars missions could take 7 months each way. No quick rescue. No immediate communication. The moon is our test environment. And every habitat design begins with the same understanding Aldrin articulated instinctively. Space is beautiful, and it will not protect you. Radiation levels on the moon are hundreds of times higher than Earth's surface. Temperatures swing from 127 degrees Celsius in sunlight to minus 173 degrees Celsius in shadow. Micrometeorites strike without warning. There is no atmosphere to burn them up. And lunar dust? It's razor-sharp at a microscopic level. Clings to suits, damages seals, causes respiratory risk if inhaled. Magnificent. Desolation. Those 2 words are now engineering principles. Artemis mission planners speak less about glory and more about mitigation. Shielding. Redundancy. Resource extraction. Because the goal isn't to visit anymore. It's to stay. And staying in a place defined by desolation requires something humanity is only beginning to master. Long-term adaptation. That's why NASA studies lava tubes on the moon. Natural caves that could provide radiation shielding. That's why 3D printed regolith habitats are being tested. Using lunar soil to build protection. Because you cannot fight desolation. You must build within it. And this is where Aldrin's words become prophetic. He didn't describe the moon as dead. He described it as magnificent. That nuance matters. Because desolation without magnificence would discourage exploration. Magnificence without desolation would encourage recklessness. He gave us balance. And balance is survival. Apollo 11 succeeded. But that doesn't mean the moon cooperated. Because the truth is, Apollo almost failed more times than the public ever realized. And the mission that proved Aldrin's words weren't poetic wasn't Apollo 11. It was Apollo 13. April 13, 1970. Houston, we've had a problem. An oxygen tank exploded. Power failing. Carbon dioxide rising. The spacecraft crippled. The moon no longer a destination, but a slingshot. They had to use lunar gravity just to survive. The mission transformed instantly. From exploration to escape. Here's the part that matters. The moon didn't care. It didn't help. It didn't hinder. It simply existed. Magnificent. Desolate. The astronauts weren't conquering it anymore. They were negotiating survival around it. Improvising CO2 scrubbers using duct tape and cardboard. Rationing water to ounces per day. enduring freezing temperatures inside the capsule. Apollo 13 wasn't a failure. It was confirmation. Space is not hostile. It is indifferent. And indifference is far more dangerous. Because hostility can be fought. Indifference must be respected. After Apollo 13, NASA's entire operational philosophy changed. Redundancy multiplied. Risk modeling deepened. Engineers began asking not, what if this fails? But what fails next? That mindset is the direct descendant of magnificent desolation. Here's a question most people never ask. If the moon landing was such a triumph, why did we stop? 6 successful landings. Then silence. The final mission, Apollo 17, left the moon in 1972. And we never returned. Why? Because once the political objective was achieved, the urgency evaporated. The Cold War space race cooled. Funding declined. Public fascination faded. And something else happened. The moon stopped being mysterious. The more we studied it, the more we understood it. It wasn't made of cheese. It wasn't hollow. It wasn't hiding alien cities. It was rock, regolith, ice at the poles, valuable scientifically, but not emotionally gripping. The romanticism faded. And what remained? Desolation. Without the magnification of rivalry, the desolation felt heavier. The cost of maintaining lunar missions was staggering. Hundreds of billions in today's dollars. And there was no immediate economic return. So we shifted to low Earth orbit. The space shuttle. The International Space Station. Safer distances. Quicker rescues. Shorter delays. But something was lost. Because orbit keeps you close to Earth. The moon forces you to confront separation. And humanity wasn't ready for permanent separation yet. We had glimpsed desolation. But we weren't prepared to live inside it. Fast forward to today. The Artemis program. Named after the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology. A symbolic gesture. Because this time, the mission isn't just symbolic. It's structural. The goal isn't footprints. It's permanence. NASA plans to establish a sustained human presence at the lunar South Pole. Why the South Pole? Because of ice. Water ice trapped in permanently shadowed craters. Water means oxygen, hydrogen fuel, life support, energy storage. The moon is no longer just magnificent. It's resource-rich, and that changes the equation. Private companies are now involved. SpaceX developing lunar landers. Blue Origin designing infrastructure. International coalitions forming. This isn't a race anymore. It's an ecosystem. But here's what's different from 1969. We understand desolation now. Artemis habitats are designed with radiation shielding in mind. Regolith-based construction to absorb cosmic rays. Autonomous systems for survival during 2-week lunar nights. Psychological monitoring for crew resilience. Every blueprint begins with the same premise Aldrin articulated instinctively. The moon will not adapt to us. We must adapt to it. And adaptation is expensive, dangerous, slow, but necessary. Because the next step isn't the moon. It's Mars. And Mars magnifies desolation exponentially. Travel time, 7 months minimum. Communication delay, up to 22 minutes one way. No immediate rescue possible. The moon is training ground, proof of concept, a rehearsal for deeper isolation. And this is where Aldrin's 6 words become something larger than history. They become philosophy. Magnificent, the drive to explore. Desolation, the cost of doing so. Modern space planners talk about multiplanetary civilization. But what they're really discussing is resilience. Because Earth is magnificent too, but fragile. Asteroid impacts, climate instability, nuclear risk. A single planet species is vulnerable. Expanding outward isn't just ambition. It's insurance. But insurance policies aren't glamorous. They're pragmatic. And pragmatism was embedded in Aldrin's tone. He didn't shout triumph. He observed reality. That realism is what makes his words echo louder today. Because we're no longer dreaming about touching the moon. We're engineering supply chains there. mining helium-3 for potential fusion energy, extracting rare Earth elements, testing autonomous robotics for deep space deployment. The moon is transitioning from symbol to infrastructure, and infrastructure requires humility. You cannot build sustainably in denial of desolation. You must design around it. That's the lesson Apollo 11 gave us quietly. Not conquest, preparation. There's a question hiding underneath all this ambition. Just because we can expand into space, should we? The moon has no ecosystem, no life to disrupt, no oceans to poison, no forests to clear. From a biological standpoint, colonizing it seems harmless. But ethics in space isn't about trees. It's about precedent. Every time humanity has expanded into new territory on Earth, it has carried conflict with it. Competition, ownership disputes, resource extraction battles, power consolidation. Now imagine that pattern scaled beyond Earth. Who owns lunar ice? Who controls helium-3 reserves? What happens when private corporations build permanent installations before international treaties evolve? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 says no nation can claim sovereignty over the moon. But it says nothing about resource commercialization in the way modern space economics demands. And that's where magnificent desolation becomes political. Because desolation creates scarcity. Scarcity creates competition. Competition creates friction. The moon is empty now. But emptiness doesn't stay neutral once humans arrive. And yet, there is another perspective. Expansion might not be about conquest. It might be about survival. Asteroid impacts are statistically inevitable over geological time. Supervolcanic eruptions are possible. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and nuclear weapons introduce man-made existential risks. A multiplanetary civilization reduces single-point failure. It's redundancy for humanity itself. The same engineering principle that saved Apollo 13. Redundancy is survival. So the ethical dilemma becomes sharper. Is it more irresponsible to expand, or to remain vulnerable? Magnificent. Desolation. The duality persists. Imagine a child born on the moon in 2085. Lower gravity. Different skeletal development. Different muscle density. Different perception of normal. That child would look at Earth the way we look at the moon. Distant. Romantic. But not home. Home would be regolith domes. Artificial sunlight cycles. Recycled air. Controlled ecosystems. And over generations, biology would adapt. We would diverge subtly, culturally first, then physically. Language would shift. Architecture would shift. Psychology would shift. Because environment shapes identity. On Earth, gravity anchors us. On the moon, gravity loosens us. Movements become longer. Jumps become slow-motion arcs. The body learns new rhythms. Isolation becomes normalized. And perhaps the most profound change wouldn't be physical. It would be existential. For the first time in history, humans would grow up knowing Earth is optional. That shifts mythology, religion, philosophy. For thousands of years, the sky represented transcendence. Heaven above, unknown beyond. But when you live beyond, the sky loses its mystery. Space becomes geography. And when geography expands, so does perspective. Conflicts rooted in borders may feel smaller when borders exist on multiple worlds. Or, they may multiply, because identity doesn't dissolve automatically with distance. It evolves. And evolution is unpredictable. That's why Aldrin's words still matter. He didn't say magnificent opportunity. He didn't say magnificent conquest. He said desolation. Because even if we populate the moon, the universe remains overwhelmingly empty. Billions of galaxies, trillions of stars, and almost all of it uninhabitable. That scale humbles identity. It reframes ego. It forces awareness of fragility. The overview effect astronauts describe, future generations may experience it daily. Looking at Earthrise from lunar soil, seeing weather systems swirl across a blue sphere, realizing every human who ever lived existed there. That perspective can unify, or it can intensify division depending on how we grow. Let's return to the surface. July 20th, 1969. Buzz Aldrin standing in powdery regolith. The horizon curved. Earth suspended in blackness. When he said, "magnificent desolation," he wasn't predicting policy. He wasn't outlining philosophy. He was observing truth. The moon is stunning, and it is unforgiving. 57 years later, that observation defines every serious conversation about space exploration. We no longer talk about planting flags. We talk about shielding from radiation, closed-loop life support systems, psychological resilience for multi-year missions. We talk about sustainability, because magnificence draws us outward. Desolation demands preparation. And maybe that's the deeper meaning. Those 6 syllables weren't about the moon. They were about us. Human beings are drawn to the magnificent, but we survive by respecting desolation. Every frontier in history has followed that pattern. The oceans, the poles, the skies, and now space. But here's the part that lingers. The footprints left by Apollo astronauts remain untouched. No wind erases them. No rain softens their edges. They could last millions of years. Long after our cities decay. Long after our languages evolve beyond recognition. Those impressions in lunar dust are frozen moments of courage. Fragile shapes preserved in permanent silence. If humanity thrives across multiple worlds, historians may look back at Apollo 11 not as the peak of exploration, but as the beginning of adaptation. And if we fail, if we never return meaningfully, those footprints will still remain. Evidence that, for a brief moment, we reached beyond our cradle. Magnificent, desolation, 2 words spoken quietly on an alien surface, but loud enough to echo across generations. Because in the end, space doesn't change. We do. And whether we expand wisely or recklessly will determine if the next words spoken on another world describe triumph or warning. The moon is still there, silent, waiting, not to welcome us, not to resist us, simply to exist. Magnificent, desolate, and now, no longer untouched. There's a lot more they don't want us asking about. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.